Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street partners with businesses, organisations, unions and social democratic parties across the globe to develop community organising strategies and train leaders to build power from within their community. And in 2021, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to share their stories, inspire others, take action, give hope and organise communities for change. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also sponsored by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Are you passionate about providing access to justice? Maurice Blackburn, Australia's leading plaintiff law firm, is looking for an associate to join their employment and industrial law team on a full-time permanent basis. You will use your legal technical knowledge and expertise to drive for fair outcomes for their clients. The role is based in Melbourne, Victoria, and to apply, simply go to mauriceblackburn.com.au/careers. That's mauriceblackburn.com.au/careers. Be part of change and fight fair. Apply now. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast that is out every Friday without fail, that dives into the progressive campaigns and the issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And on this week's episode, I'm joined once again by a writer and senior Australian public servant, Andrew Weir. He was on the show many moons ago to talk about a book that he wrote way back then. And he's back on the show this week because he's written a new book. He's been busy during lockdown. It's called Recovery: How We Can Create a Better, Brighter Future After a Crisis. So Andrew comes on the show today to talk about that without giving all the details away. But we have a bit of a discussion about how we could use this moment to change the direction of our great nation. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, I guess Stitcher. And if you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser, and I'll read it out on air beforehand. And actually, I'm going to do a shout out. Shout out to one of our listeners, Matt, who likes to have a bath every morning. I only found out about this the other day. Bravo. I like that. That's cool. Who does that these days? Who even has a bath at all? But who has a bath in the morning to get ready for work? That is so baller. I really respect that. More of us should be doing that. That's pretty cool. And also shout out to Anna, who asked us during the week, where is our New York mayoral election wrap? If you remember, the New York mayor election was on a month ago, maybe? Who knows? Anyway, we had Sam Schneidman on to talk about it. Sam's candidate lost, probably why he didn't want to come back on the show again. But we are lining up Sam to come back on as we get closer to the US elections, the gubernatorials, which will be in early November. So maybe, Anna, when Sam comes on then, we can get a bit of a wrap on what in the end happened with the New York mayoral elections. But thank you for checking in with us. And don't forget, for all the updates, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn. Okay, let's get to today's episode. We're taping this one on a Thursday afternoon in lockdown in Melbourne. We had Andrew Weir on the show back in, I think, 2019. Must admit, the last, as it is for everyone, the last 18 months has been a bit of a blur, so I completely lost track of time. But he was on to discuss his last book, which was titled Solved: How Other Countries Have Cracked the World's Biggest Problems and We Can Too. He's now written a new book. He's been very busy. It's called Recovery: How We Can Create a Better, Brighter Future After a Crisis, which would be a very good title for Ange Postecoglou after he's finished a season at Celtic, when he writes a book about that. Andrew, for those of you who don't know who he is, he's a senior Australian public servant with a degree in politics, law, economics and public policy. He's a graduate of the Senior Executive Fellows Program at Harvard University, the Kennedy School of Government there, and a Victorian Fellow of the Institute of Public Administration Australia. And he's on today's show to talk to us about that new book that he's written. Andrew, welcome back to Socially Democratic.
Thanks, Stephen. Great to be here. Thanks for having me again.
Can you actually remember when you were last on the show? Was it pre-COVID? I can't remember.
I think it was early COVID, early 2020.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. How have you been since then? How's the family? How are you surviving this whole lockdown experience that we're going through again here in Melbourne?
It's a bit crazy, isn't it? I'm locked at home with many small children. I think we're all going a bit stir crazy, to be honest. It's cumulative, I think, in the effect, isn't it? It's I think it's taking its toll. I think I'm seeing it taking its toll across the not just the family, but I think across the community. And when we come out the other side of this, I think it'll be important we take stock and make sure we invest in nurturing ourselves. I think there's going to be a few people that are struggling.
Yeah, without a doubt. And it's hard to get a sense of that because we're all kind of isolated. That, you know, the social cues that we pick up from our friends and family tend to normally be through face-to-face contact, but we're not having that anymore. It's either telephone calls or maybe, I mean, we've chucked the whole Zoom party out the window. No one's doing them anymore. But, you know, it's just seeing folks and trying to pick up social cues from talking to them on a phone limits that ability to get a sense of how your loved ones are doing and going through this experience.
Yeah, I think so. I think humans are fundamentally social animals, and to be locked up it's a cruel and unusual punishment, I think, for people. I mean, even for introverts, I think it's so it'll be interesting to see how we come out the other side of this.
Well, coming out the other side is obviously something that you've written about as well in this book. You don't muck around. I tell you what, when it comes to punching out books, you've obviously got a lot of ideas and you want to put them down on paper. So this is another great book that you've written. Just talk to us through about the genesis moment or moments that inspired you to want to write about this particular topic of recovering from such a monumental moment in history.
Yeah, well, thanks, Stephen. I started a new job right at the start of the pandemic back in March 2020 at the City of Melbourne, leading the economic development team there. And it was crazy time. Lockdowns, businesses really struggling, everything being shut. And I spent 9 months working remotely with a team that I'd never met in the flesh, working all hours of day and night, trying to throw whatever we could at the problem to try and keep businesses afloat, and was very much an in the moment sort of desperate sort of response. But at some point it became clear that we had to actually lift our gaze beyond just the immediate and think through, what is this going to mean for the future of the city, the country in that medium to long term piece. And the question of what do we do about it, and what can we how should we think about that problem of the medium to long term? And it became apparent that we hadn't done this really before, and where were we going to get the lessons from? And the obvious place to look was those places, those cities, those countries that had recovered from past crises and recovered well. And so what I made the effort to do was really to go back and investigate particularly those really successful recoveries where places have recovered to become even better than before, and look at the great recovery success stories throughout history. So when you look at places like Germany after World War II went on to boom, you had Roosevelt and the New Deal. After the Great Depression, you had the Roaring '20s earlier in the United States after the Spanish flu. South Korea after the Korean War, Aceh bouncing back from natural disaster in the tsunami in 2004, Christchurch after the 2010 earthquakes. There's a whole series of stories about places recovering, not just to get back to where they were, but actually to reinvent themselves, to go on and to be bigger, more prosperous, in their outlook, and actually go on to thrive. And I guess the question really was, what sort of insights can we gain from those experiences to form a sort of, I guess, a view about what we need to be doing, what we need to be talking about now to set Australia up for a successful recovery on the other side of this pandemic.
If that's the central premise, what's the argument of your book? What are you arguing here?
I guess what I'm arguing is that we need to lift our gaze now, even ahead of the end of the pandemic, to actually start putting in place the building blocks to set Australia up for a prosperous medium to longer term. if we project forward 10 years' time, say we're in 2031, the things that will have made the greatest difference to where Australia is in 2031 will be the things that we do over the next year or two to set ourselves up. It'll be economic development of new industries. It'll be how did we invest in the education, so that we're building a highly educated workforce through our children, through investing in our children. Did we address the social determinants of health to make us all more resilient? All those sort of things are what is fundamentally going to strengthen us as a nation. And we need to be getting on with that. We need to be developing a vision. We need to raise our ambition, I guess, for what Australia can become. And we need to be, I guess the fundamental argument is that recovery should be thought of as an opportunity. And it's too good an opportunity to miss.
Early in the book, you wrote about the disaster management cycle, and I assume that has nothing to do with the current Boston Red Sox pitching rotation. Talk to us a bit about that, and then I want to ask you about some of the examples that you did look at in terms of how countries have or cities have recovered from disasters.
Yeah, sure. Well, without getting too wonky, the disaster management cycle is something that's used by those who work in emergency management. You might think about bushfires, say in Australia. You've got really four points on the sort of cycle. You think about it not in terms of a linear cycle, but in a linear sort of response, but in terms of a circle that never stops. So you might have a disaster, say a bushfire, or in this case, a pandemic. You respond to it. You throw everything you've got at it. You put the fires out. You test and you trace and you do all the things that it's required to in the immediate to respond to the crisis. In the period that follows, you've got to recover. You put the pieces back together. You rebuild the houses. You remediate the education lost through the pandemic and all the things that we need to do to recover. But then it's important that you don't stop there. We then think about mitigation because there's future crises going to come. There's always another crisis on the horizon. So how do we ensure that we're stronger and we're more resilient for next time round? And then we prepare. We make sure in anticipation of future crises, we make sure that we've got the firefighting forces ready to go, or we've got the health system ready to respond to a pandemic. And I think it's about all of those things. So far, all we seem capable of thinking about is response, but we need to be thinking about all of those points in the cycle, because to do them well is really, really critical. Because I don't know if you remember back in the start of this pandemic in 2020, but just before the pandemic landed, Australia was emerging from those massive East Coast bushfires. It's highly likely that as we go through the recovery process, Australia is going to bump into another crisis of some sort, whether it be more bushfires, whether it be floods, droughts, cyclones, whatever, you name it, particularly with more frequent and intense weather events because of climate change. It's highly likely that our recovery will be interrupted by future crises. We need to get really good at crisis. We need to get really good at recovering. We need to get really good at preparing and mitigating for the future.
Talk us through or unpack some of the examples that you did draw on the book. And I'm always conscious when I have guests on who want to talk about their book, I don't want them to give away all the secrets of the book because then they don't read the damn book, but just maybe draw on one or two as a teaser for our audience that will give them an interest in reading it. What are some of the natural disasters or events that you looked at to study and get a sense of what lessons did they draw from to help them with that recovery process?
Yeah, well, I'll give you a couple. I'll give you two to start with. And I guess one is around the Great Depression in 1929 in the US in particular, the epicenter of the Great Depression. And you had Franklin D. Roosevelt, who led the New Deal and the process of recovery there. There are a whole series of things we can learn from that. Obviously, the role of government in inspiring confidence came through really strongly. FDR, when in his story of a vision for the future of what America could become, inspired confidence. Secondly, he set up an iterative process. The Great Depression, the New Deal was not a grand plan that was developed, locked in stone, and then implemented. It was this creative, iterative, experimental process that involved liaising with experts, unions, community members to generate a whole series of ideas that were then tried. Some failed, some worked. Those that failed were thrown out. Those that worked were they doubled down on. And the sense of being able to create work with the community on a vision for what America could become. Big ambitions for. It wasn't just about recovering from the crisis, from the recession. It was actually about building an America of the future. So it was things like the big projects around the Mississippi River and the Hoover Dam and things like that. It was sewerage in a city like Atlanta that enabled the South of America to grow and prosper, and we're still seeing that through the Sun Belt in America today. Big projects like the bridges and airports in North America that we're still seeing, and all of that set America up for the growth throughout the 20th century. It changed obviously also to the relationship of the US with government. Beforehand, if people were struggling, if families were struggling, it would be up to families to basically be the social security net. The New Deal basically changed that relationship so that people formed an expectation that government did have a role in stepping in when crisis hit. The lessons for that for Australia are quite profound. We're clearly not in the same situation as the US was back then, but in thinking about an inspiring message from government, a big vision about what recovery could yield in terms of a future nation, an experimental and iterative approach to our recovery, drawing in multiple voices and contributions. All of that points to a certain direction for us in our recovery process. That's one. I'll just give you one more. And Aceh, you'll remember back in 2004 with the tsunamis, in the Indian Ocean tsunamis, the Aceh was the epicenter of the destruction there. More than 160,000 people died, 500,000 people, much of the population had houses wiped away. It was devastation. The Indonesian government at the time set up a disaster recovery agency in partnership with the regional government. And at the heart of that recovery process was this notion of a community-led recovery, working with communities, not in a top-down way, but in a very collaborative way with communities, so that communities would work in their villages to determine what sort of reconstruction process they wanted and they owned. So there's a couple of things that come through from the Aceh response that are relevant. One is a community-based approach. The other one is a partnership between levels of government, really critical. And then the other one is, I guess, resolution of deep, contradictions or tensions or conflicts that run through society. In the case of Aceh, they'd experienced decades of civil war with the Free Aceh movement seeking independence from Indonesia. And only once that could be reconciled and put to bed and peace could be found, could recovery continue, because ultimately with decades of civil war under their belt, trust was at a minimum. People couldn't trust different villages and neighbours, and that was absolutely fundamental to the recovery process. So resolving the question of conflict was really at the heart of it. And I think in a country like Australia, what that points to, for example, is at the heart of the Australian nation is this conflict over the sort of the foundation stories of dispossession, of genocide that sort of underpinned Australia. And we've got that conflict and that sort of that schism at the heart of the Australian identity that, until that's resolved, we're going to struggle to go forward with maturity too. So I think there's all sorts of lessons we can learn. I looked at about 10 different recoveries throughout the book, but they're just two to get us started, Stephen.
Look, you've got a lot. You've mentioned a couple of crackers there and a bit to unpack. And I'm just trying to work out where I want to go with this conversation now, because I do want to talk at some point about where you think Australia should go. But before I do that, I should actually ask a question about what are the conditions required in a constituency or in a community. And I'm using that in a very, very broad sense. So that can go from both high levels of government right down to, folks on living in their neighbourhoods, what are the conditions that are required for us to have that conversation or debate to then start to consider what a recovery needs to look like? Because one of the things I've picked up from those two examples that you've mentioned, both Arche and in the United States, that it involved community as well as obviously government. And it also trust was a word that you used in both examples. And I'm just thinking about that in terms of Australia. Are we conditioned right now to have that conversation?
No, I think that's exactly the challenge, Stephen. I think one of the starting points for us as a nation is going to be to reach agreement over exactly what we're recovering from. How has the pandemic impacted Australia? And I think we'll need to go through and have that conversation, because some of the stuff won't be all that obvious. Everyone will pick up headline numbers like deaths, in case numbers, or they'll pick up impact on GDP or unemployment, and they're the big headline numbers. And in a lot of ways, a country like Australia, those headline numbers haven't been too bad. Our death rates is one of the lowest in the world. Our economy at the macro level, sure, we've lost 2 years of economic growth, but unemployment's not too bad, and we're not one of the worst in the world. We're going to have to get under it. We're going to have to look at things like mental health, impact on lost learning in schools. We're going to have to look at lack of business investment. We're going to family violence. There'll be all sorts of insidious impacts of this pandemic that we're going to have to unpack and reach agreement about as a nation, because only once you can actually have a clear conversation about what we're recovering from can we work out how we should approach that recovery. I think it's important, though, that we all have. What I'm ultimately really concerned about is that we get out of this recovery and then we just go back to get out of this crisis and we go back to exactly the way things were. We get on with it. We have all this partisan bickering. We we don't have a clear vision for the country, and when we go back to it. And ultimately, what I would hope we can have is a conversation about what sort of nation we want to become, and how we might go about getting there, and how that might intersect with our recovery. I mean, at the biggest macro level, Stephen, I think we've got to think about not just recovery, but all the other big strategic challenges that we're grappling with as a nation. The next decade or so is absolutely, not just in Australia, but everywhere, the decade we have to get on top of climate change. We have to decarbonise. It's very, very clear. It's also the decade we're recovering from COVID. And Australia's also got long-standing issues with inequality that we need to grapple. I think the great opportunity is for us to be able to use our recovery to get on top of our recovery and tackle those other issues at the same time. And other nations around the world are doing that right now. We've got, Germany out there is basically focused on leveraging its economic recovery to build new industries that are going to set it up for the future. It's investing in a green hydrogen industry, for example, that will enable it to export its renewable energy in the form of hydrogen. You've got South Korea. It's got this Korea New Deal that it's assembled with many, billions and billions of dollars focused on building new industries in Korea. I mean, so we seem to be missing from that space, and other countries are going to get the jump on us, I think.
And look, I don't want to completely blame the federal government, but I'm going to, and I'm conscious of yourself being a public servant, so I don't want to draw you too much into the politics of it all. But, when I think about the role of federal government, I think about the role of our leaders, there's such an absence of leadership right now in this country, which creates a lack of environment, for want of a better word, to have these kind of conversations, because we've got a federal government that doesn't really want to talk about climate change. And if they do, they're using it as a political wedge, as opposed to, most other countries in the world, generally speaking, there is a bipartisan position, whether you be centre left or centre right, on climate change and the need to address it. And maybe the differences of opinion are the nuances about exactly how much money or how you go about it. But broadly speaking, they all recognise. But we've still got large chunks of members of the federal government that don't even think it is real. That's how far behind the conversation we are on that. We have had 18 months of this horrific pandemic has been treated like a political football by our federal government that has, I think, divided the federation in ways that I think are unhealthy for our country. And this, when we at federation, when we've brought together all of these British colonies to create this union, I don't think they ever foresaw 100 however many years later that would be, shutting down borders and whatnot, and not looking at this issue from a national perspective. I know they've got the national cabinet, and has been good at times, but broadly speaking, I think it has struggled. And I think it's come from I lay the blame at Scott Morrison's feet. I just think that he's the wrong person at the wrong time. And the things that you're talking about, which I completely agree with, and I know all of our listeners would be completely in unison in terms of what you want to do and what we need to do as a nation, we're not going to get that right now with this Tory government in place, because I just think that they are not looking at, they're looking at the next election cycle, not the next 10 years.
Stephen, I think it's incumbent upon all of us, though, to be having these conversations regardless of what our federal government does. I guess my concern is that the media, think tanks, academics, everyone involved in political and policy debate in this country is almost entirely consumed with the short-term tactical focus on getting through COVID over the next 6 months. And so you'd hardly blame a government in one sense if they are too. It's effectively where the entire nation is at the moment. And I think I think it's on all of us to actually try and also have a parallel debate about the bigger vision for what the next decade holds for Australia, and what the post-COVID period needs to look like. I'd like to see us all talking about it. Yes, I'd like to see the federal government leading it, but in the absence of the federal government leading it, I think it's incumbent upon us all really to have that discussion and have that debate and build the momentum more broadly.
And, you're inspiring the community organiser in me here and thinking about, absolutely, how can we create this debate from the ground up? And my mind's already starting to think about, so you've written a book. Who are your allies out there that are also trying to have this conversation, that we can bring these resources together to make that voice just that wee bit louder?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's plenty of people who want to have the debate and don't disagree with the notion, many of the ideas in the book. I think the terms of the debate that we're having in the public domain at the moment don't allow much space for that conversation to be had. And I think we need to be forcing that conversation into the public domain much more than we are. I certainly see that when it comes to, most people in the community, to be frank, and I don't want to speak for the entire community. I mean, that's very presumptuous, but to argue that we would like to create a better future after a COVID, not just go back to the way things were, that's not a very difficult sell, Stephen. It's actually to invite then the community to have a conversation about what their vision for a better future is post-COVID, without even telling them the answer, just to even create the space to invite the community to participate in a discussion around that. I think that's the exciting space that we should be trying to force open. And I guess my book, in a sort of slightly wonky sort of way, is my effort to sort of get that conversation going, I guess.
And I think, absolutely. And I think that I think people do want to have that conversation. I've got some friends who are in the business of qualitative, quantitative research, and they are telling us that even I'm sick of talking about COVID. I think I'm sick of talking about COVID.
But yet you do.
Yeah, absolutely. Here I am on a bloody podcast. And what are we doing? We're talking about COVID, right? The whole episode is talking about how do we get past this moment. So even though I know I'm sick of talking about it, I'm still talking about it. And that's what's coming up in the research, is that people can't not talk about it. It's it's at the forefront of their minds. It's dominating the media cycle. It's got stats. We all love stats, but it's also got a narrative. So it's got stories that underpin it. So it's a really good TV show that's happening every night.
It's got heroes and villains. It's got all the ingredients. It's got a daily press conference for us all to tune into. But it's my goodness, that's exhausting. Just keeping up with that and participating, and depressing. So I'd much prefer us to be having a more elevated discussion.
But I think that from that TV show, there's always the spin-off Frasier. And I think that what we can see from some of the conversations people are having about COVID is eventually people get tired of talking about the now and they actually do start to talk about the future, in which one of the things that comes up is employment. So maybe we can talk a bit about that. I'm interested to get your thoughts on that, because you hear a lot of folks saying, surely once we're through this, we all can't just go back to working in the same workplace again, and that our employers will embrace this change for the long term. Whereas some people go, oh, no way, my work will make me all, particularly school teachers, in fact, will say, no, we're all going to have to go back to how it was before. Here is an opportunity for us to grapple with some of these questions, and this is an ultimate fork in the road for our society in terms of how we set up our work arrangements. What are your thoughts on this?
I think there's a couple of different dimensions to work, and I think you're right in pointing to that as one of the spaces that'll be contested into the future. At one level, you've seen that work arrangements have actually played a really critical role in shaping the pandemic. You've seen people in employment, in vulnerable employment, or who've been in casual work, have had to work more than one job. People in low-paying jobs, such working in nursing homes, security industry, food processing, delivery drivers, you name it. It's people working in those low-paid, insecure jobs that have actually been the most. They've been particularly vulnerable themselves, but they've also through their vulnerability, they've actually created vulnerabilities for all of us in a lot of ways. And so I think what that's shown is that precarious employment, inequality has actually left us all more vulnerable than we otherwise should. So I think that does raise that question about precarious work, about casual work, about the quality of work. That's I think that's left there on the table for us to work through and resolve. Particularly when those workers are typically the essential workers that are the ones exempt from, and they're the ones unable to work from home. And they're often typically living in very overcrowded housing and exposed to COVID. At the other end, the people like me confined to working from home during this pandemic. The question is, will we ever go back to the office? And I think that question is also, there's plenty of people willing to speculate about this. And I think there's very few people that can say for certain. I think what does appear to be the case is that the relationship with the office has changed probably forever, in the sense that why would you go into the office and work at a computer in a cubicle if you can do the same thing just as easily from your kitchen table? Maybe the role of the office will be about networking, collaborating, catching up with people face to face, and less about working on your computer. I'm already hearing that the way offices work will change, less about back of house and more about the front of house space. It's the meeting room space. It's the function space. It's the sort of things where it's all aimed at bringing people together. And I think consequently what that implies is something about the way our cities function, particularly the way our inner cities function, our CBDs. People less about being a place to work and more about a place to basically meet other physical human beings, which is something we all miss. And I think in the case of knowledge work, bumping into people physically, collaborating, catching up for a coffee, having a workshop, randomly meeting people in the street, all of that is absolutely what drives knowledge work. And I think we might see an amplification of that. So the role of the city will change, the role of office work will change. And I think we also have to ask that question around the role of precarious work too. That's left there as well for us to deal with.
Speaking about precarious work, something that absolutely shat me off this week, and I don't know why it got to me, but maybe just being locked in at home for a while will do that too. But reading in the news that the Minister for Agriculture in the federal government has managed to get legislation through that there's been a lift on temporary visa workers from overseas, bringing them into Australia to meet the demands of the fruit picking industry because they couldn't get folks to pick the fruit. Historically, that work has gone to overseas workers that have come in, like the people like backpackers and temporary visa workers. And obviously with the border restrictions that they were unable to source that work. And they were rejoicing that they had got a win there to lift those restrictions to bring those workers in. And it just really shat me off because, when the economy is full of workers, the argument from the marketeers is that, well, then the market will determine what people's wages are, therefore wages will probably come down or hold. But then when there is a scarcity of people to do the work, then obviously the market will determine that we'll have to pay you a higher rate to get your skills, and therefore, and that we don't want the dead hand of government to come in and intervene in any of that in any way, shape or form until now. And just pay Australian workers or people who are living here, pay them more money and they will come and pick the fruit. And they didn't do that. And it's a classic conservative politics where they go, why can't we have it how it used to be? So what worries me, to the point about your whole book, about recovering what new ideas we can think of about going out of it, I think there certainly is one element in the political debate that are going to reject every element of your book out of hand because they don't want that and they don't want to go back. They want to go back to how it was before. And that concerns me.
Mm. Yeah. And I think that what you point to, I think is if I could broaden out your point a little bit, was that the role of migration for the Australian economy, I think, is a really interesting one. We've seen over the recent decades, migration's played a huge role in underpinning the Australian economy in terms of growth. Yet for the past 2 years, effectively, we've seen zero or close to zero migration. And so that offers an opportunity to, I guess, to rethink, the role of migration in the Australian economy. And it'll be really interesting. We've seen, for example, our biggest services export industry ground to a halt was international education, and the role of those international students play in cities like Melbourne and Sydney. We've seen skilled migration stop, which means that some industries are struggling to find those skilled workers, and what does that imply? And we have seen that the vast in those industries that rely on volumes of migrants to sort of prop up demand, they're the ones I think that are going to have a rethink. And I think for me that poses all the questions like, what is the role of migration? Ultimately it can't just be to just provide more demand, because that's doesn't increase overall well-being anyway. I mean, you put more people in the economy, all it just means is there's more people in the economy. It doesn't make us richer. But if you're bringing in migrants who are highly skilled, then you actually potentially can help contribute to developing new knowledge-based industries that are that leverage the best and brightest from around the world to create new industries that increase prosperity for everyone in the country. So I do think we probably, it opens up that box, basically, the pause on migration that we've seen. And I think there's another conversation that we, as a nation, we need to have about what is the future of migration in this country.
Yeah, as you're saying that, I'm thinking about the words on the Statue of Liberty, give me your hunger, you're tired, you're poor. And I think there's a place for those people in this country. This is a huge bloody continent that we all live on.
Yeah,
a hell of a lot of space. I know that globally there's not a lot of resources to go around, and and I don't want to get too macro because obviously I think they're talking about the population of the world is about to actually kind of plateau and then maybe fall away anyway. But our migration policy mix has to be a bit of that both, isn't it? It's giving you skilled folk, but also this has got to be a refuge for folk that are looking for a better life. Yeah,
that's right. But I think that there's probably, I agree totally with you. It's got to be that humanitarian component and the selective high skilled component that sort of adds to the richness of the mix of what contributes to the Australian economy. What I worry about is the bit in the middle, which is effectively the filler. Just packing more people in. It's not for humanitarian reasons necessarily. It's just there's no shortage of people all around the world who want to move to Australia for economic reasons. They're not necessarily higher skilled. So it's just that it's that piece. And I think, look, let's have that discussion. I think, Stephen. Yeah. I think it's the fact that even the federal government's not forecasting a return to the same migration levels as we've seen in recent years, for some time. So we've got time to sort of think through what are the appropriate migration settings, I think.
Let's talk about something that's really urgent for not just us in Australia, but also around the world, and that is addressing the issue of climate change. You said in your earlier remarks that, we're kind of on a 10-year window here that we need to address that. Notwithstanding the lack of motivation from the current federal government, and I think we may have talked a little bit about this last time when you were on the show, but I'm keen to get your thoughts on how do we structure the debate in such a way that it stops being the third rail of Australian politics to start with, because even, to be fair, Labor's scared shitless of even talking about climate change, but at the same time, we're going to have to pick this scab off and actually have a good chat about it and actually work out some solutions.
Yeah, I actually think that the solution is presenting itself to us, whether we want it or not, and that is that climate change increasingly is less about an economic threat to this nation, but it is an economic opportunity that is too good to miss for us. And I think, whether it's Labor or the federal government actually framing climate change and decarbonisation as an economic opportunity is the way through this mess. That's going to be done to us whether we have political leadership doing it or not. You've got all the largest companies in the world already choosing to decarbonise. You've got the major investment funds, whether BlackRock in the United States and others, they're just divesting from investing in coal. There's billions and billions and billions of dollars of capital lined up ready to invest in investments that are around decarbonisation. You've got Australia with all of the right ingredients to create to be a renewable energy superpower, generating renewable energy in such quantities and at such low cost, better than anywhere else in the world. You've got technology developing so that we can store that energy locally in batteries, potentially even exporting it in the form of hydrogen. You've got the European Union about to put carbon tariffs, on carbon intensive products, so that when we're exporting concrete and steel and aluminium from Australia, it'll have a tariff on it into the European Union if we have not got carbon priced in appropriately. It's going to be forced upon us. We can either be late to the party or we can be early to the party and carve out an economic opportunity for ourselves as a nation. And I think, for me, it's a no-brainer. The countries around the world that are really embracing industry policy, and I think Australia's been sadly lacking in the industry policy space in recent years, but countries such as Germany and South Korea are building their industry policy around decarbonisation, creating new industries that position them as global leaders in this space. Super exciting. And Australia really has that opportunity almost sitting there on a silver platter waiting to be taken for the right, and companies in Australia are taking it, whether governments are acting or not.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for that moment when big business in this country starts to throw around their weight a little bit in the direction of either the existing federal government or a future Labor government. Even looking at companies like Origin Energy and that you can see that their messaging is starting to frame around renewables and the like, but clearly that message isn't being heard loud enough on the government benches of Parliament. Second last question for you is, what is the hope from within this book? How do you turn these words that are on a page into sort of tangible outcomes, or what are your next steps? What do you hope to get from writing such a book?
a couple of different things there, Stephen. I think, firstly, I really want to give people a sense of optimism. It's been such a depressing period, this COVID period, giving people a sense that what comes next can be an exciting, bright, better future than the one we've had before. Inspiring people with a sense of hope and optimism, I think, is at the sort of base level what I wanted to do. And the evidence from those past crises around the world throughout history is that when you look through that sort of longer lens, recovery in a sort of decade or so afterwards can yield a much better future. And I think we can have that too in Australia. So I want to inspire people with that sense of hope and that sense of optimism. At a very practical level, I want the policy settings that we collectively adopt as Australians, and that's not just the federal government; it's every state government, it's local governments, it's us working in civil society more broadly, be geared around positioning ourselves to capitalise on the opportunity that our recovery presents. To I guess the cement is a little bit wet at the moment. We've got the opportunity to shape it into whatever we want before that cement dries and we go back to the old ways. And so I want us to be having that conversation now, collectively, about what it is that we want to create after the pandemic. And I think the stories that come from past crises provide us, I think, with a bit of the fuel to sort of stimulate our imaginations about what might be possible in Australia. Clearly, you can't translate exactly what happened 80 years ago or 100 years ago or 50, 20 years ago in a different context, in a different crisis directly to Australia. But what they can do is fire up our imaginations. What could we become? What could we do? And having more of those sort of expansive discussions and debates as a country is really what I hope for and what I hope to be contributing to in my own small way.
And it starts on really good podcasts like this one, Andrew. Thank you very much for your time. How can you get the book?
So the book, Recovery, How We Can Create a Better, Brighter Future After a Crisis, will be in bookshops if they're open, all around the country. But if not, online. It's published through Black Ink, but you'll find it everywhere.
I think we'll probably chuck up a couple of links in the bio of today's episode as well, if they're available, Andrew. I'm sure they are. Yep. blackinkbooks.com is the publisher of this fine book, Recovery, How We Can Create a Better, Brighter Future After a Crisis. Andrew Weir, thank you very much for your time today and best of luck with the online book tour.
Good on you, Stephen. Thanks for your time. Really appreciate it.
Hey there. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And to get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.